She was carrying a tray. That is how she entered the most important room of the evening, not through the front door, not announced by name, not dressed in silk or pearls, or any of the things that had once been hers by right. She walked through the servants' entrance of a house that had once opened its grandest doors for her, wearing a gray uniform 2 sizes too large, her hair hidden beneath a white cap, her eyes low. No one looked at her, no one ever looks at the staff. And that precise, invisible position, was exactly what she had counted on. 300 guests filled Aldermoor Hall that evening, dukes, lords, ladies of considerable fortune and considerable opinion. They had come to witness a wedding, to drink champagne poured by hands they would never bother to look at, and to remind each other, in the elegant and ruthless language of the aristocracy, exactly where everyone stood. They had no idea that the woman refilling their glasses had once sat at the head of that table. They had no idea that the portrait at the top of the grand staircase, the woman in deep blue, painted with the kind of gravity reserved for people of consequence, was standing 20 feet away from them in an apron. And they had absolutely no idea that before the night ended, something would be said in that ballroom, one sentence spoken clearly, without hesitation, that would cost the most powerful family in the room everything they had spent years protecting. This is the story of Marguerite, a woman who disappeared quietly, who came back invisibly, and who, without raising her voice or shedding a single tear, changed every version of every story that had ever been told about her. Stay with her tonight, because the moment that broke everything open is closer than you think. The chandeliers of Aldermoor Hall had been lit since dawn. 300 guests filled the grand corridor, dressed in silks and jewels that caught the light like small fires. The air smelled of white roses and ambition, and not a single person in that room suspected that the most important woman in the building was carrying a silver tray. She moved between the guests with practiced stillness, her eyes low, her steps measured. The gray uniform was 2 sizes too large. Her hair was pinned beneath a white cap that sat slightly crooked on her head. No one looked at her. No one ever looks at the staff, and that, she had learned long ago, could be the most powerful position in any room. Her name was never announced that evening. It didn't need to be. But before the night ended, every single person in Aldermoor Hall would know exactly who had been pouring their wine, and the silence that followed that revelation would be the loudest sound the estate had heard in 20 years. If this opening already has you, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss a story like this one. The best part of this evening has not even begun yet. Stay with us. The portraits on the walls of Aldermoor Hall had watched generations of the Ashford family pass beneath them. Dukes, viscounts, commanders, all rendered in oil and gold frames, their expressions carved into permanence. She walked beneath them without looking up. She already knew their faces better than most people in that room. The guests whispered about the flowers, about the bride's gown, about the fortune that would change hands with the signing of the marriage contract. A woman near the fireplace laughed too loudly at something a lord said. Another adjusted her pearls and scanned the room for someone more important to speak to. No one adjusted their gaze downward, not toward the woman in gray refilling glasses along the eastern wall. What none of them knew was that she had stood in this very hall 17 years ago in a different kind of dress entirely, that the portrait at the top of the grand staircase and the one with the serious woman in deep blue was painted from a sitting she had endured for 3 long afternoons, that the hall of titles they celebrated inside tonight had once, briefly, been hers to call home. It had started with a letter, not a formal one, no wax seal, no crest, just a folded piece of paper slipped beneath the door of a modest room in a quiet part of the city, written in handwriting she recognized immediately, despite the years. Come if you want the truth. Come quietly. Come as no one. She had stood at the window for a long time after reading it. The truth. She had spent years deciding she no longer needed it, that she had made her peace with silence and distance and the life she had rebuilt without the Ashford name attached to it. But the letter had found her anyway, the way certain things always do, at exactly the moment when the walls feel thinnest. So she had come. She had borrowed the uniform from a woman who owed her a kindness. She had pinned her hair, lowered her eyes, and walked through the servants' entrance of a house that had once opened its front doors for her. She told herself she was only there to watch, to understand. To finally close a door she had left ajar for too long. She did not yet know that the knight had entirely different plans. He was tall and confident in the way that young men with inherited names often are, as though the world had always leaned slightly in their direction, and they had simply grown used to it. He stood near the center of the room receiving congratulations with a practiced smile, his new bride beside him, like a well-chosen accessory. He shook hands. He laughed at the right moments. He never once looked at the staff. She passed within 3 feet of him carrying a tray of champagne flutes. He reached out without looking and took a glass. His fingers brushed hers, just barely, just for a fraction of a second, and he pulled back to clink glasses with a friend without ever raising his eyes. She steadied the tray. She breathed. She moved on. He did not recognize her. She had expected that, had even counted on it. But there was something quietly devastating about being invisible to someone who carried half the story of your life inside his last name. She set the tray down near the window and looked out at the dark gardens below. The roses were blooming. They always bloomed in late spring at Aldermoor. That, at least, had not changed. The east corridor of Aldermoor Hall was quieter than the main rooms, a narrow passage used by staff to move between the kitchen and the ballroom without disturbing the guests. Marguerite had taken that route 3 times already that evening, tray in hand, eyes forward. On the 4th pass she slowed. 2 voices were coming from behind the half-open door of the sitting room, and one of them belonged to Isadora. She was not speaking to Fletcher. She was speaking to her mother, a sharp-featured woman in dark green silk who had arrived late and positioned herself near the most influential guests with the precision of someone who had done it all her life. The words that reached Marguerite through that door were not cruel in volume. They were cruel in their certainty. Isadora spoke about the Ashford title the way one speaks about a property already purchased, its value, its complications, its inconvenient history. And the inconvenient history, it became clear within seconds, was Marguerite herself. She stood in the corridor without moving. The tray in her hands was perfectly still. She had spent years building a life where those words could no longer reach her, where the Ashford name was simply something that had once been attached to her and then wasn't. But hearing yourself discussed as a liability by a woman who did not even know your name has a particular kind of sting. Marguerite adjusted her grip on the tray. She turned, she walked back toward the ballroom, and she made a decision she had not planned to make when the evening began. She had come to Aldermoor to watch, to understand, to finally close a door. But what she had just heard in that corridor had changed everything, and the decision she made in the next 60 seconds, walking back toward that ballroom with a tray in her hands and a ring in her pocket, would set in motion the most important night of her entire life. Keep watching. Because the room is about to find out exactly who has been pouring their wine. Cornelius did not arrive at his son's wedding in a carriage. He came on horseback, alone, without announcement, a choice that had raised eyebrows among the staff who spotted him crossing the east gate and said nothing to the guests inside. He was a man who had long stopped caring about the geometry of grand entrances. He cared about being present. He had not always been good at it. He was trying now to be better. The ballroom received him with the particular energy that powerful rooms reserve for powerful men. A slight shift in attention, a rearrangement of bodies, a wave of whispers that traveled faster than he walked. Fletcher saw him from across the room and nodded with the restrained warmth of a son who had learned not to expect more. Cornelius nodded back. He accepted a glass of wine from a passing member of staff without looking down. Then he looked down. The hand that had given him the glass was bare at the wrist, no glove, which was unusual for the evening's staff uniform, and on the inner wrist, just below the cuff of the gray sleeve, was a small scar in the shape of a crescent. He had watched that scar form 23 years ago in the garden of a house that no longer belonged to either of them. He had watched it because he had been sitting beside her when it happened. His eyes moved upward slowly. The woman in the gray uniform was already walking away, but he had seen enough. There are women who disappear dramatically, who leave in the night with packed trunks and borrowed carriages, who write letters full of accusation and grief. Marguerite had not been that kind of woman. She had left on a Tuesday morning quietly with 2 bags and the particular stillness of someone who has already done all their crying in private. She had not left because Cornelius had been cruel. She had left because he had been absent, and absence, sustained long enough, becomes its own kind of violence. For 3 years inside Aldermoor Hall, she had tried to build something real inside a marriage that treated her like a well-chosen ornament. She had hosted dinners, managed the estate correspondence, learned the names of every tenant and their families. She had done everything asked of a duchess and several things that were never asked of anyone. And Cornelius had looked through her the way a man looks through a window, aware of the glass, grateful for the light it lets in, never once stopping to consider the view from the other side. The morning she left, she placed her ring on the writing desk in the east study. Not on his desk, on hers, the one they had given her when she arrived, and she had slowly filled with her own correspondence, her own records, her own handwriting. She left the ring there as a statement, not a wound. She was not trying to hurt him. She was simply done waiting to be seen. What she had not anticipated in all the years that followed was that the place she had stopped waiting in would one day ask her to return, not as a duchess, but as someone who carried trays and kept her eyes low and listened to everything. The city had been kind to her in the way that large cities are kind to women who need to become no one, quietly, without ceremony, simply by offering enough noise and movement that a person can step sideways out of their own story. Marguerite had taken a modest set of rooms near the old library district, learned which markets opened early, and built a life that asked very little of her name and everything of her character. She had work that used her mind, correspondence management for a small publishing house whose owner asked no questions and paid fairly. She had a window that caught the afternoon light at an angle she had come to love. She had learned to cook 3 things well and stopped apologizing for only knowing 3. She was not happy in the way she had once imagined happiness, but she was steady, and steady had come to feel like its own quiet miracle after years of beautiful instability inside Aldermoor's walls. The letter had arrived on a morning when the light through her window was particularly good. She had read it twice, set it down, made tea, and read it a 3rd time. Come if you want the truth. Come quietly. Come as no one. She had recognized the handwriting as Reginald's. Old Reginald, who had served the Ashford estate for 40 years, and whose loyalty she had never once questioned. She trusted him completely. She did not yet trust the night he was sending her into, but she folded the letter, finished her tea, and began to think about where one borrows a uniform when one has been a duchess for 3 years and a nobody for 7. Marguerite had not intended to bring it. It had been sitting in the same small wooden box for 7 years, the box she kept on the second shelf of her wardrobe, behind a stack of correspondence folders in a position that required deliberate effort to reach. She had not worn it since the Tuesday morning she walked out of Aldermoor. She had not sold it either, though there had been one winter when selling it would have made the cold considerably easier to bear. She had found it in her hand the morning she dressed for the wedding, standing in her modest room in the gray uniform that was slightly too large, her hair already pinned beneath the white cap, looking at the ring in her palm the way one looks at something that belongs to a different version of oneself. She could not explain the impulse. She only knew that walking into Aldermoor Hall felt like the kind of night that required something solid to hold on to, something that belonged to the truth of who she was, even if no one in that building would be permitted to know it. So she placed it in the front pocket of the apron. She could feel its weight against her hip all evening, a small, constant pressure, like a word she was not yet allowed to say. When Cornelius had taken the champagne glass from her tray, and his eyes had moved upward and found her face, her hand had gone instinctively to that pocket. Not to show him, not yet. Simply to hold the thing that proved she had once been real inside those walls, and that some part of her, despite everything, still was. Reginald had been watching the door since 7:30. He stood near the serving corridor with the patience of a man who had spent 4 decades learning that the most important moments in grand houses almost always happen in the margins, in hallways, near windows, beside doors that are slightly ajar. He had written the letter. He had arranged the uniform through a contact he trusted absolutely. He had told no one else. He saw Marguerite the moment she entered through the east passage, recognized her walk before he recognized her face, the way one recognizes old music before identifying the melody. She moved with the same particular stillness she had always carried, that quality of occupying space without announcing it, which had made her both easy to overlook and impossible to forget. He did not approach her immediately. He let her find her footing in the room first. He watched her take the tray, join the rotation of staff, disappear into the geometry of the evening as cleanly as if she had rehearsed it. It was an hour later that he found a moment to pass close to her, near the east wall, close enough to speak without being heard, without stopping, without either of them turning their head. "He doesn't know you're here yet," Reginald said quietly, eyes forward, voice barely above the level of the music. "But there is something in this house tonight that you need to hear before he does." Marguerite kept walking. She gave no visible reaction, but her grip on the tray tightened slightly, and Reginald, who had known her for 10 years, understood that she had heard every word. Cornelius had seen the scar. Reginald had delivered his warning. And somewhere in that ballroom, Isadora was beginning to understand that the woman in the gray uniform was not who she had assumed. 3 people now knew the truth, and the moment all 3 of them ended up in the same room, nothing about that evening was going to survive intact. The next 5 minutes of this story will change everything. Stay with us. It started, as most things in aristocratic ballrooms start, with a woman who could not resist the pleasure of knowing something others did not. A guest near the north window had been watching the gray uniformed staff member by the east wall with a particular kind of attention, the attention of someone who is trying to place a face and cannot quite manage it. She leaned toward the woman beside her. She said 3 words. Those 3 words traveled across the room in under 4 minutes. The whisper moved the way whispers always move in rooms full of people who have been trained since childhood to communicate without appearing to communicate, through slight turns of the head, through eyes that hold a second too long, through the particular stillness that falls over a small group when information of interest passes between them. By the time the murmur reached the far end of the ballroom, it had collected details it did not originally contain, and shed the uncertainty it had started with. That is the nature of ballroom whispers. They arrive at their destination as certainties. Fletcher heard it from a man standing to his left, a distant cousin of the family who had drunk 2 glasses too many and had not yet developed the social restraint to keep his voice at an appropriate level. The words reached Fletcher mid-sentence, mid-smile, mid-handshake. His expression did not collapse immediately. It simply paused, froze in place for exactly 1 second longer than was natural, before he excused himself with perfect composure and turned to scan the room with eyes that were, for the first time all evening, no longer entirely certain of what they were looking for. Isadora was not a woman who lost her composure easily. She had been raised in a household where emotional displays were considered a form of weakness, and social precision was considered a form of survival, and she had absorbed both lessons completely. When the whisper reached her, she received it with a stillness that might have looked like calm to anyone who did not know her well enough to read the particular way her left hand tightened around the stem of her glass. She found Marguerite near the fireplace, still in the gray uniform, still carrying the tray, still moving through the room with that infuriating quality of quiet self-possession that Isadora had heard described once, years ago, by someone who had known the first Duchess of Ashford and had never quite stopped talking about her. She looked at the woman by the fireplace for a long moment. Then she crossed the room with the measured pace of someone who has decided that speed would be an admission of alarm. She stopped 2 feet away, close enough to speak without being overheard, far enough to maintain the architecture of composure. She looked at Marguerite directly, at the gray uniform, at the white cap, at the tray held with the steadiness of someone entirely unbothered by being looked at, and said in a voice kept carefully low that she did not know what the purpose of this evening's performance was, but that she expected it to end immediately. Marguerite looked back at her with the particular expression of a woman who has already survived the worst version of this conversation, and finds the current version considerably less frightening than the other person believes. She said nothing. She simply waited, and the silence between them was somehow entirely in Marguerite's favor. Cornelius had been standing near the grand staircase when the room changed. He had felt it before he understood it, that particular shift in the energy of a crowded space, when collective attention moves from performance to spectacle. Conversations shortened, bodies turned. The orchestra continued playing, but nobody was listening to the orchestra anymore. He followed the direction of the room's attention and found Isadora standing 2 feet from a woman in a gray uniform near the fireplace, and the woman in the gray uniform was Marguerite. He did not move immediately. He stood very still for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was, taking in the scene with the measured eye of a man who has learned, through decades of costly mistakes, that the first impulse in a charged situation is rarely the correct one. He saw the tray in Marguerite's hands. He saw the steadiness of her posture. He saw Isadora's carefully maintained composure, and read beneath it, with the accuracy of long experience, the particular quality of a woman who feels her ground shifting and is working very hard not to show it. He set down his glass. He crossed the ballroom without hurrying. The guests who saw him coming stepped aside, not because he asked them to, but because Cornelius had always moved through rooms in a way that made space feel like a natural courtesy rather than a demand. He stopped beside Marguerite, not between her and Isadora, beside her, close enough that the positioning alone said everything that words had not yet been permitted to say. He looked at Isadora with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely unmistakable. Then, without raising his voice, without addressing the room, without performing anything for anyone, he said her name, not Isadora's name, Marguerite's. What followed happened in the compressed, crystalline way that defining moments always happen in crowded rooms, too fast for anyone to intervene, too slow for anyone present to ever fully forget. Isadora had made a calculation. It was visible in the half-second before she spoke. The rapid weighing of options, the selection of the weapon most likely to cause irreversible damage, the particular brightness that comes into certain eyes when they have decided that if they are going down, they are taking the room with them. She spoke clearly enough to be heard by the nearest guests without appearing to raise her voice, a skill that requires years of practice and a specific kind of malice. She said that she had known about Marguerite's presence in the house since the second hour of the evening. She said that she had chosen to say nothing out of respect for the occasion. Then she said the thing that cost everything, a precise and carefully assembled claim about the reason Marguerite had left Aldermoor 7 years ago, a version of events that had circulated in certain social circles for years, a version that Marguerite had never publicly contested and that Cornelius had never publicly corrected. It was the kind of claim that does not need to be true to be damaging. It only needs to be said aloud in a room full of people who will remember it. The silence that followed was absolute. The orchestra had reached the natural end of a phrase and paused between movements, which meant that Isidora's last sentence had landed in a room with no sound at all to cushion it. Cornelius stood very still. Marguerite stood very still. And then Cornelius turned to face the room, not Isidora, not Marguerite, but the room, and spoke in a voice that carried without effort to every corner of Aldermoor Hall. What he said in the next 40 seconds did not save Isidora's dignity. It did not save Fletcher's evening. But it permanently and irrevocably ended the version of events that had followed Marguerite for 7 years. And it cost the Ashford title exactly 1 engagement, because Fletcher, standing at the edge of the room with a champagne glass he had forgotten he was holding, heard every word his father said and understood for the first time the full weight of the history he had been given without ever being told its true shape. Every person in that ballroom was watching her. Marguerite was aware of it the way one is aware of weather, not as individual drops, but as a complete and surrounding condition. She had imagined in the years since leaving Aldermoor that if she ever found herself back inside a version of this moment, she would feel the old familiar pull toward smallness, that instinct to fold inward, to apologize for existing in a space that had decided she was inconvenient. She had spent 7 years rebuilding herself specifically against that instinct. Standing in the middle of Aldermoor Hall with 300 pairs of eyes on her gray uniform, she discovered that the rebuilding had held. She removed the white cap. It was a small gesture, unhurried, almost casual, but it moved through the room like a statement. She unpinned her hair with the same deliberate calm, and it fell the way it always had, the way that the portrait at the top of the grand staircase had captured it 20 years ago in deep blue oil paint. There was an audible reaction from somewhere in the middle of the room, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, something between the two that confirmed what the whisper had already begun to establish. She set the cap on the tray. She set the tray on the mantelpiece beside the fireplace. Then she turned to face the room with her hands at her sides and her chin at the precise angle of a woman who has decided quite simply that she is done being diminished. She did not speak. She did not need to. Cornelius had already spoken, and his words were still settling over the room like something that had been dropped from a great height. What Marguerite offered instead was something that no speech could have provided, the physical, undeniable fact of her presence, standing in the hall of a house that had tried to erase her, in a uniform that had tried to make her invisible, looking more like a duchess than anyone else in the room. Reginald, standing near the serving corridor with the stillness of a man who had orchestrated exactly this moment, allowed himself a single slow exhale. It had gone, all things considered, precisely as he had hoped. She had removed the cap. She had unpinned her hair. She had stood in the center of the room and refused, completely, quietly, finally, to be made small. But the night was not finished with her yet, because Cornelius was still standing beside her, and he had something left to say. Not to the room, not to Isidora, not to anyone who needed to hear it for the sake of appearances. He had something to say to her, and what he said next, after 7 years of silence, was either going to close every door between them or open the only one that had ever mattered. Don't go anywhere. By the following morning, the account of what had happened at Aldermoor Hall had traveled through the drawing rooms of 3 counties with the velocity that only the most extraordinary social events achieve. Each retelling added texture and lost accuracy in roughly equal measure, but the central architecture of the story remained consistent because it was too specific and too witnessed to be significantly reshaped. The Duchess of Ashford had attended her stepson's wedding dressed as a member of staff, had been recognized by the Duke himself, had been publicly attacked by the bride-to-be, and had stood in the middle of the ballroom and removed her cap with the composure of a woman receiving a formal greeting rather than surviving a public assault. The element that no one had anticipated, and that proved in the days that followed to be the detail that society could not stop turning over, was not the disguise or the confrontation, or even what Cornelius had said to the room. It was the silence of Marguerite herself. She had not defended herself, she had not explained, she had not wept or trembled or reached for anyone's arm. She had simply stood there, entirely herself, and allowed the room to recalibrate around the fact of her. In a world that had spent 7 years constructing a narrative about a woman who had run from shame, the sight of that woman standing perfectly still in the eye of a fresh storm was genuinely disorienting. Fletcher had left the ballroom shortly after his father spoke, not in anger, not in tears, but with the quiet, slightly dazed movement of a young man who has just been handed a piece of information that requires him to re-examine a significant portion of his own history. Isadora had remained. That had surprised people. But she was a woman who understood that leaving a room was an admission, and she was not yet prepared to admit anything. She stood near the window with her glass and her composure, and her mother's dark green presence beside her, and she watched the room decide what it thought, and what the room decided, as the evening wore on, was not what she had calculated. The guests had thinned by midnight, but had not entirely left. Those who remained were the ones who understood that the most important part of any evening rarely happens during the official program. They occupied the edges of the ballroom with their glasses and their carefully neutral expressions, watching the center of the room the way people watch a stage between acts, uncertain whether the performance is finished or simply pausing. Cornelius found Marguerite near the grand staircase. She had not moved toward the exit. She had not moved toward him either. She had simply settled into a stillness near the base of the stairs, the gray uniform still on, the cap gone, her hair down, looking precisely like what she was, a woman waiting to see what the next chapter of a very long story would ask of her. He stopped 3 feet away. The remaining guests did not pretend not to watch. There was no architecture of privacy available in that room at that hour, and both of them understood it. He did not speak quietly. That was the thing that the people present would remember most precisely in the years that followed, that he did not lower his voice, did not lean in, did not attempt to make the moment smaller than it was. He spoke at a normal volume, in a room that had gone completely silent, and what he said was not a performance for the audience, and was not diminished by having one. He said that he had been wrong. He said it without qualification, without the additions and justifications that men of his position customarily use to soften the shape of an admission. He said that what had been said about her for 7 years was false, that he had known it was false, and that his silence had been its own particular form of cruelty. Then he said that he was asking, not expecting, not assuming, simply asking, whether she would be willing to allow him to spend whatever time remained to him correcting what he had permitted to stand uncorrected for far too long. She looked at him for a long moment before she answered. Not the look of a woman deciding. She had, in some essential way, been deciding for 7 years, and the decision had been made and remade and refined until it had the particular clarity of something that has been held up to the light from every possible angle. It was the look of a woman choosing her words with the precision they deserved, in a moment that had waited long enough to be given its full weight. She said that she did not doubt his sincerity. She said it plainly, without softening it into a compliment or sharpening it into a condition. Then she said the thing that made the remaining guests go very still, that forgiveness and return were not the same thing, and that she had spent 7 years learning the difference. She had forgiven him, she said, somewhere around the 4th year, in a small room near the library district, on a morning when the light through her window was particularly good. She had forgiven him because carrying that particular weight had been making her smaller, and she had decided she was done becoming smaller for the sake of anyone's unfinished business. But forgiving a man and rebuilding a life with him required 2 entirely different qualities of trust, and trust, unlike forgiveness, could not be granted. It could only be grown. The room held its breath. Cornelius held very still. And then Marguerite did something that no one present entirely expected. She reached into the pocket of the gray apron and placed the ring on the mantelpiece between them. Not on her finger, not in his hand. Between them, on the marble, in the candlelight, where both of them could see it. She said that she was not saying no. She said she was saying not yet, and that if he understood the difference between those 2 answers and was willing to work within it, then perhaps they had somewhere left to go. It was the most honest thing said aloud in Aldermoor Hall in 20 years, and it was the only answer that could have made Cornelius look, for the first time all evening, like a man who had just been given something worth having. Spring came to Aldermoor the way it always had, slowly, then completely, the gardens filling with the particular white roses that Marguerite had always loved and that no one had ever thought to ask her about. She was not living at Aldermoor when spring arrived. She was still in her modest rooms near the library district, still managing correspondence for the small publishing house, still waking to the light through her window at the angle she had learned to love. But the letters had started arriving, not demanding, not assuming, simply present, the way Cornelius himself was slowly learning to be present after a lifetime of magnificent, costly absence. The ring had remained on the mantelpiece at Aldermoor for 3 weeks after the wedding night. Then Cornelius had moved it, not to a drawer, not to a box, but to his own writing desk, where it sat beside his morning correspondence as a daily reminder of the precise distance between where he was and where he needed to arrive. Fletcher had come to see him twice during those weeks. Their conversations were not easy, but they were real in a way that their previous conversations had rarely been. 2 men working through a history that one of them had been given incomplete, sitting in the east study with the door open and the spring air moving through the curtains. It was not reconciliation exactly. It was something more honest than reconciliation. It was the beginning of an accurate account. Marguerite attended a small dinner at Aldermoor on the last evening of April, not as staff, not as duchess, simply as herself, which turned out to be the most powerful version she had ever occupied. She wore deep blue. She sat at the table where her correspondence desk had once stood, and she talked and listened and laughed once. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that surprises the person producing it. And when Cornelius heard it from across the table, he looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something he had not known he had lost until it was briefly, tentatively, returned to him. The ring was not on her finger that evening, but when she left, she did not leave the way she had left 7 years ago, with 2 bags and finished crying and a silence that had taken years to cross. She left with the door open behind her, and that, in the end, was the only ending this story was ever going to allow. Not the grand restored gesture, not the public declaration, but the small, chosen, daily decision to leave the door open and see what grows in the light that comes through. And that is how a woman who arrived as staff left as the only person in that room who had never needed a title to know exactly who she was. If the story stayed with you, give it a like. It takes 1 second, and it tells us that stories like this one deserve to keep being told. subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell, so you never miss the moment when a woman finally decides that the door she left open was always meant for her own return. And if you know someone who has spent too long waiting to be seen, share this video with them today. We'll see you in the next story. Someone is already standing in the hallway, and this time, they are not carrying a tray.